Hello and welcome to the AP World History Podcast. This is episode 7, Roads of Silk, Sea, and Sand. Instead of focusing on one or two world regions, this is a thematic podcast that focuses on trade, commerce, in the classical and post-classical worlds. If you look at the AP World History course outline, this podcast touches on many of the course themes, but especially theme number 4, creation, expansion, and interaction of economic systems. So throughout world history, trade has profoundly impacted both the largest civilizations and nomadic people that lived close to these large civilizations. And throughout world history, people and civilizations have traded with each other. In the broadest sense, the motivation for trade comes from the different parts of the earth. Different ecological zones contain different natural resources: coastlands and highlands, steppe and farmlands, islands and mainlands, valleys and mountains. Each zone generates products and is home to resources that other people want. So specifically, what I'm going to look at with this podcast is what were the major trading routes in the classical and post-classical worlds? Where and between whom did trade take place? How did goods travel long distance? How did trade provide an opportunity for social mobility in fundamentally rigid societies? How did trade help spread religion? And how did trade help spread disease? So generally speaking, what was the impact of the trade? Well, for one, it gave people more stuff, led to more varied diets and more products. It changed jobs, so it encouraged people to produce things for sale in distant markets, and this led to increased specialization, and in some cases it created food crises, because instead of producing food, people were producing goods for sale in faraway lands. Trade created a new social class. Traders often became a distinct social group, and historically traders, the social group or the merchant class, was looked upon suspiciously by others because of their ability to accumulate large amounts of wealth without actually doing any of the hard physical labor. Trade became a means of social mobility. It allowed people who were not necessarily born into lots of money to make a fortune through trade. Trade further distinguished rich and poor. The rich were able to acquire prestigious goods from far-off lands, which added to their prestige. Trade motivated politics and the creation of states. The wealth available from controlling and taxing trade led to the creation of states around the world that were really dependent on trade. And trade became the vehicle for the spread of religion, technological innovations, disease-bearing germs, and plants and animals to regions from faraway places. So, for example, Buddhism moved from India to Central and East Asia along the Silk Roads, and Islam moved from West Asia to West Africa through trans-Saharan trade routes. So did the germs that led to the plague. By now we have learned that Eurasia was the birthplace of most of the world's largest civilizations, and throughout human history, Eurasia has remained the most densely populated region on the planet. So it makes sense then that the largest, longest-running network of exchange connected farmers, pastoralists, and large urban centers of Eurasia. So stretching from modern-day Turkey to eastern China, this network of exchange and trade is known as the Silk Roads. And trade along the Silk Roads was relay trade. And what I mean by that is traders didn't travel from one end of the road to the other all in one trip. Instead, the Silk Road was basically a network of cities that sprung up along the route, and merchants would typically trade with people at the next Silk Road city. Silk that traveled from China to the Roman Empire, for example, would pass through the hands of many middlemen. So it was very expensive to move goods, and the price of goods would increase dramatically from starting point to final destination. A piece of silk could be worth 100 times as much as it costs to produce by the time it reaches its final destination. So what made trade along the Silk Roads possible? Well, trade always existed between what we'll term Inner and Outer Asia. And Inner and Outer Asia is a useful way of thinking about the peoples of Eurasia. Outer Eurasia is made up of the relatively warm areas that get a good amount of rain and are suitable for agriculture. And these areas include China, India, Southwest Asia, or the Middle East. And these places had the geography to support densely populated civilizations. Inner Eurasia refers to areas further north, not as well suited for agriculture, and this includes areas like modern-day Mongolia, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and eastern Russia. And the people of the Eurasian steppe were primarily pastoralists. So trade occurred for thousands of years between the pastoral peoples of Inner Asia and the agricultural people of Outer Asia. The pastoralists would provide animals and the products of their animals, such as furs and wool, in exchange for agricultural goods and tools. And this type of trade was happening for a long time. But the more long-distance trade was extremely dangerous, and one of the reasons it was so dangerous is because nomads would raid caravans that were carrying trade goods. So what made long-distance trade possible was the growth of massive civilizations in the classical area that spanned Eurasia. So Persian Empire, Alexander the Great's empire, the Roman Empire, the Han Dynasty. All of these massive empires led to the building of roads and bridges, so that by the 1st century CE, trading routes linked people of China all the way to the people of Rome, even though the two civilizations knew very little about each other. The amount of goods that were traded on the Silk Road varied throughout history. The trade was most successful when massive states ruled over the lands and could provide security for the traders and travelers. This was very true when Rome and Han China bookended both ends of the Silk Roads. During this time, the Parthian Empire ruled Mesopotamia and Persia, and the Kushan Empire ruled India. This was also true during the 7th and 8th century, when the Byzantine Empire ruled the eastern half of the old Roman Empire. China was ruled by the Tang dynasty, and the Muslim Abbasid dynasty ruled all of Southwest Asia, stretching into North Africa, all the way to modern-day Spain and Portugal. And this was true when the Mongols, of Genghis Khan fame, in the 13th and 12th century created an empire that ranks along the British Empire of the 20th century as the largest empire the world has ever seen. Goods were transported along the Silk Road using camel caravans. And camels are an ideal pack animal because they can go without water for 10 days. And they could handle the varied terrain of the steppe and the desert. We know the price of goods increased dramatically from origin to destination, so it didn't make sense to trade just any goods along the Silk Roads. So if you're going to go through all the trouble of moving a good, it better be worth a lot of money. So what this meant was the only goods that traveled along the Silk Roads were luxury items. So this was things like mirrors and furs, horses, cotton, spices, swords, gold, perfume, jewelry, and, of course, silk. Initially, silk was produced only in China, and China monopolized the trade by keeping the production of silk secret, or how to produce silk a secret, and involved farming silkworms. But by the 6th century, knowledge of the technology had spread beyond China. And there's a couple of legends that tell the story of how this technology was spread. A Chinese story tells the story of a Chinese princess who smuggled out silkworms when she was married off to a Central Asian ruler. A European version of the story attributes it to Christian monks who snuck out silkworms in a bamboo cane in an act of espionage, allowing the technology to take shape in the Byzantine Empire. So, however it happened, many people eventually learned how to produce silk. The owning of silk served as a status symbol in the Roman Empire, but it also led to some social upheaval. Wealthy elites were spending exorbitant amounts of money on silk items, when at the same time many people lived in extreme poverty, and this didn't go unnoticed by the public. In Central Asia, silk was used as a form of currency or as money. Silk became associated with the sacred in both Christianity and Buddhism. Buddhist pilgrims who made their way to China from India took large amounts of silk with them to offer as gifts to the monasteries. Buddhist monks in China received silk robes as a sign of high honor from Tang Dynasty emperors, and European churches were decorated with silk wall hangings and altar covers, and much of the silk found in European churches was actually manufactured in the Muslim world, and many of the silks were embroidered with verses in Arabic from the Quran. So, compared to the global trade of today, the Silk Road trade was really small scale. The fact that it dealt with luxury goods meant that most people didn't acquire goods from the trade, but it did have some important consequences, both economic and political. So, for example, peasants often gave up focusing on producing food and instead focused on producing luxury goods for a more lucrative foreign market. And it also offered people a degree of social mobility, so people felt that they could increase their social class by becoming a merchant. They weren't stuck in a rigid class system as much anymore. The economic impact of the Silk Roads was huge, but it was really the cultural impact and the spread of diseases that would have the bigger imprint on world history. Trade brought different people into contact, and through this contact, culture and ideas were shared and transmitted, and in no cases was this more true than with Buddhism. So remember Buddhism from your readings and the Belief System podcast. It came after Hinduism. It borrowed many of the ideas from Hinduism, but it also emerged as a critique of Hinduism. The Buddha was critical of Brahmins and the caste system, and Buddhism was a more inclusive and equal religion than the more rigid caste system that you'd find in Hinduism. So this appealed to merchants in particular. Merchants were not necessarily upper caste people in India, so trade offered a degree of social mobility, and that kind of goes hand in hand with being a merchant. Buddhism was largely blocked in the West by Persian Zoroastrianism, but the religion found a more willing audience in the East. And during this time, we saw the emergence of these cities in Central Asia that were completely dependent on trade to survive. Places that could not support the populations of India and China through agriculture. Places in modern-day Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. So you have the emergence of big cities like Samarkand in modern-day Uzbekistan. And it was in these cities along the Silk Roads, these new cities, that Buddhism caught on. And the religion appealed to the elites in these trading centers because it connected them to India, which was viewed as a much larger, grander, wealthier civilization. In China, Buddhism remained a religion of the merchant class until around the 5th century, and during this time, China was thrown into a period of social upheaval. Buddhist monks and missionaries capitalized on this period to spread the faith. And after Buddhism took root in China, it quickly spread into Japan and into Korea. So the nature of the Silk Road east of India was changed by Buddhism. Monasteries sprung up in all the major trading centers, and there were places where merchants would feel at home away from home. But the Silk Roads also changed Buddhism in some fundamental ways. Like initially, Buddhism was a religion that shunned wealth, but Buddhist monks started to be on the receiving end of large amounts of gifts from merchants who practiced Buddhism. Traders and travelers not only brought goods and culture, but they also brought disease, and major urban centers all had their own diseases and ways of dealing with them, and in some cases immunity to diseases. But as people increasingly came into contact with each other, more diseases were spread back and forth among the civilizations. So diseases like smallpox and measles, bubonic plague were extremely deadly. In the 6th to 8th century BCE, the bubonic plague ravaged the Mediterranean basin. In the 14th and 13th century, the Mongol Empire unified a large portion of the Eurasian landmass, and this facilitated the spread of the Black Death, which is really a package of infectious diseases that devastated the continent from China to Europe. Between the years 1346 and 1350, 1/3 of the population of Europe died from the plague. But it didn't just hurt Europe. Similar death tolls hit China and the Islamic world. But in the long run of world history, exposure to these infectious diseases gave Eurasians a decided advantage when it came to confronting people in the Western Hemisphere. Uh, Remember from Guns, Germs, and Steel, these people in the Western Hemisphere lacked the domestication of animals, where many of these infectious diseases began.